People today are obsessed with the end of the world. Each and every year we see countless books, TV shows, movies, and video games depicting some kind of apocalyptic event, a massive pandemic, a worldwide catastrophe, an alien invasion. And for most of us, these are works of pure fiction, as entertaining as they are unlikely. But for people who grew up during the height of the Cold War, the end of the world was not an idea relegated to comic books. It was an ever-present threat. At its core, the Cold War stemmed from the deep ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ironically, the US and the USSR were actually allies during World War II, but that's only because the overwhelming threat of Hitler had a way of making strange bedfellows. Soon after the war became clear the countries were so fundamentally different, peaceful coexistence was just not an option. A report by the National Security Council presented to President Truman in 1950 said, quote, "The Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world." This led to the strategy often referred to as containment, which sought both to undermine Soviet ideology and to promote Western values of freedom and prosperity throughout the world. But of course, this could not be done through any kind of direct engagement. Nuclear weapons made that impossible. To quote Ronald Reagan, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought." Direct engagement with the Soviets was not an option, as it would inevitably lead to a nuclear war annihilating both countries. This is the essence of mutually assured destruction.
Greetings, Professor Falcon.
Hello, Joshua.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
So the two countries had to fight each other indirectly through economic attacks, proxy wars, covert ops, and propaganda campaigns, but never outright battles between the two militaries. As part of this strategy, institutions and initiatives like NATO, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan were all created to help spread Western values and support allies of the United States. And despite both countries wanting to avoid war, the tension was so high that small mistakes could have disastrous consequences.
And although this sounds melodramatic, I don't mean it that way, but you ask what was the mood at the time. I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
This is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara speaking on the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's impossible to understate just how close the world came to all-out nuclear war during this crisis, and how lucky we are to have had Kennedy and Khrushchev at the helm. It's true, Kennedy made mistakes early on. During his campaign for presidency, he repeatedly discussed the existence of a missile gap between the US and the Soviets. In fact, the US had many more missiles than the Soviets, and Kennedy knew that, but it was helping him in the polls. Unfortunately, it also helped instigate an arms race. Nikita Khrushchev, chairman of the USSR, was meanwhile telling his people, "We are producing missiles like sausages." In fact, the USSR had just 2 missiles at the time, but as Khrushchev said, "What difference does it make how many missiles we have so long as the Americans think we have many?" To his dismay, the Americans did know, and after Kennedy was elected, they announced it publicly. The Americans also had missiles in Turkey within range of the Soviets. This placed an immense amount of pressure on Khrushchev to close the gap, and it's why he made a deal with Fidel Castro to create a missile site on Cuba. On October 16, 1962, the United States discovered this missile site on Cuba, which would allow the Soviets to strike the United States as far inland as Dallas, Texas, with virtually no warning. This terrified officials in the US government, and when a low-level member of Kennedy's team asked him what was going on, Kennedy said, quote, "When you find out, you'll grab your balls." EXCOMM, the executive committee of the National Security Council who was advising Kennedy, was comprised mostly of hawks. Upon learning of this missile site, Secretary of State Rusk went so far as to suggest eliminating the entire island of Cuba as a way to eliminate the threat. Others suggested an airstrike or an invasion force to remove the missiles. But these options presented an extraordinarily high risk of escalation. What the Council and Kennedy did instead was institute a quarantine surrounding Cuba with US ships. It was essentially a military blockade and an act of war, but by calling it a quarantine, the US avoided the escalation an act of war would have necessitated. So now you have a standoff. More Soviet ships are steaming toward Cuba and toward the US blockade. President Kennedy is preparing an invasion force to put thousands of US troops on the ground in Cuba. The Soviet general on Cuba is equipped with nuclear weapons specifically designed to target US ground troops. And the US military is at DEFCON 2 with planes buzzing around in air, just waiting for a nuclear war. Throughout all of this, Kennedy and Khrushchev are sweating bullets. And this is really the critical aspect of the crisis. Despite being surrounded by hawks, both Kennedy and Khrushchev were determined to avoid war. In their secret back channel, Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy and said, quote, "Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. Because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it." For days, the world held their collective breath, fearing the worst. Kennedy put the odds of nuclear war as high as 50%. And as he readied the US invasion force that would have invariably forced Khrushchev's hand, he made one final offer. Remove the missiles from Cuba, and in exchange, the US will publicly declare not to invade, and quietly remove the US missiles in Turkey and Italy. He gave Khrushchev 24 hours to respond. And Khrushchev agreed. On October 28th, the crisis publicly ended after 2 weeks of terror. This event marks the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. And it's important because it shows just how precarious Cold Wars can be. Every tiny action can have unforeseen ripple effects no one ever desired. Understanding how the US and the USSR were able to avoid an all-out war despite decades of tension is crucial, because it is possible, if not probable, that the United States will soon be engaged in a new Cold War, and this time with an altogether more capable competitor, China. Hey guys, thank you for watching this video. As always, please let me know what you thought in the comments below, or on Twitter or on Facebook, or all the places. I do really enjoy interacting with you guys, so please do that. And also, as you can probably guess, next week's video will be about the rising tensions between China and the US. So look forward to that next Friday, 6 p.m. And yeah, that's it guys. Hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next week, Friday. I love you. Goodbye.